Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. A world where shadows held power, where a single blade could topple kingdoms, and where death came not with fanfare, but with whispered promises and silver coins. We're diving into the harsh, unforgiving world of ancient traders who risked everything for profit. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're a merchant in the ancient world, standing at the edge of civilization, with nothing but a caravan of goods, a handful of desperate men, and the distant promise of riches. The year is 200 BCE, and the trade routes stretch before you like veins of gold threading through a landscape designed to kill the unprepared. You're not some romantic adventurer from a storybook. You're a businessman. And your business happens to be one of the most dangerous occupations in human history. Ancient trade wasn't about quaint market stalls and friendly haggling over pottery. It was about survival in its most brutal form. Every sunrise brought new threats. Bandits who would slit your throat for a handful of copper coins, diseases that could wipe out your entire caravan in days, and natural disasters that turned profitable ventures into mass graves. The Silk Road wasn't called a road because it was safe and well maintained. It was called a road because it was the only path between profit and poverty, between civilization and the vast empty spaces where men disappeared without a trace. The truth is, most ancient traders never made it home. They died in deserts, were murdered in their sleep, or simply vanished into the mists of history, their bones scattered across forgotten paths. But the ones who survived, who learned to navigate this world of calculated risks and necessary violence, they built empires. They connected civilizations. They carried not just goods, but ideas, languages, and cultures across thousands of miles of hostile terrain. Your typical merchant wasn't some well-dressed gentleman with a counting house and a comfortable bed. He was a walking contradiction, part businessman, part warrior, part diplomat, and part gambler. He carried a sword as readily as he carried his scales. He spoke 5 languages and trusted no one completely. His success depended not just on knowing the value of silk or spices, but on reading the intentions of strangers, the mood of local rulers, and the shifting political winds that could turn a profitable trade route into a death trap overnight. The goods themselves were often worth more than kingdoms. A single pound of saffron could buy a house. A bolt of Chinese silk could feed a family for a year. Precious stones, rare spices, exotic perfumes, these weren't luxuries in the modern sense. They were concentrated wealth, portable fortunes that made their carriers targets for every desperate soul between here and there. But here's what the history books don't tell you. The real currency of ancient trade wasn't gold or silver. It was information. Knowing which passes were safe, which rulers could be bribed, which seasons brought raiders, and which local customs could get you killed for an innocent mistake. A successful trader was essentially a mobile intelligence network, gathering and selling information as carefully as he traded his physical goods. The routes themselves were arteries of civilization, but they pulsed with danger. The Silk Road connected China to the Mediterranean, but it passed through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Merchants faced the scorching heat of the Gobi Desert, where water was more precious than gold, and the bitter cold of mountain passes, where the air was so thin that men and animals died simply from trying to breathe. The Amber Road brought Baltic treasures south to Rome, cutting through forests filled with wolves and tribal warriors who viewed foreign merchants as convenient sources of wealth and slaves. The incense route connected the perfume gardens of Arabia to the temples of Egypt, but it meant crossing territories controlled by Bedouin tribes who demanded tribute and weren't particularly concerned about whether you could afford to pay it. And then there were the sea routes, where merchants faced storms that could destroy months of work in hours, pirates who operated with the efficiency of small armies, and the constant threat of being lost at sea with no hope of rescue. Ships were floating warehouses filled with fortunes, making them irresistible targets for anyone with a boat and a willingness to kill. But perhaps the greatest danger wasn't physical at all. It was economic. Ancient markets were ruthless, unpredictable beasts. A trader might arrive in a distant city to find that his goods were worthless, that a local war had disrupted demand, or that a competitor had flooded the market with cheaper alternatives. Men who had invested everything in a single caravan could find themselves ruined overnight, left with nothing but debts and the long, dangerous journey home. The successful traders developed a network of contacts that spanned continents. They had agents in distant cities, informants among local officials, and partnerships with other merchants that were sealed not with contracts, but with shared risks and mutual survival. Trust was a commodity as valuable as any spice, and betrayal was often a death sentence. These merchants didn't just trade goods, they traded in human lives. Slavery was a cornerstone of ancient commerce, and traders dealt in people as casually as they dealt in silk or gold. They understood that in a world where labor was the foundation of wealth, human beings were simply another form of merchandise. It was brutal, pragmatic, and absolutely essential to the economic systems that connected the ancient world. But slavery wasn't the only dark trade. Merchants dealt in weapons that would fuel wars, poisons that would eliminate rivals, and information that could topple governments. They were the middlemen of civilization's shadow economy, facilitating the flow of everything that polite society preferred not to acknowledge. The physical toll of this life was enormous. Traders aged rapidly, their bodies worn down by constant travel, poor food, and the stress of perpetual danger. Many developed chronic illnesses from exposure to foreign diseases. Others bore the scars of bandit attacks, animal encounters, or simple accidents that occurred far from any help. The ones who lived long enough to retire often did so as wealthy men with bodies that had paid a terrible price for their success. Yet, despite all these dangers, despite the brutality and the risks, ancient trade flourished. Why? Because the profits were extraordinary. A successful trading expedition could yield returns of 300, 400, even 500%. Men were willing to risk everything because the potential rewards were beyond imagination. A single successful journey could set up a man's family for generations. The psychology of these traders was fascinating. They had to be simultaneously cautious and bold, paranoid and trusting, ruthless and diplomatic. They needed the courage to venture into unknown territories, the wisdom to navigate complex political situations, and the steel nerves required to negotiate with people who might kill them if the talks went badly. This was a world where reputation meant everything and nothing. A trader's word had to be absolutely reliable in business dealings, but he also had to be capable of deception, misdirection, and even violence when the situation demanded it. Honor and pragmatism existed in an uneasy balance, and successful merchants learned to switch between them as easily as changing clothes. Tonight, we're going to walk in their footsteps. We'll explore the routes they traveled, the dangers they faced, and the incredible fortunes they made and lost. We'll see how these desperate, driven men connected civilizations, spread cultures, and built the foundations of the global economy we know today. Because understanding their world helps us understand our own. The principles of risk, reward, trust, and survival that govern their lives still shape commerce today. The ancient traders' world was harsh, unforgiving, and absolutely fascinating. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a season, where a man's life could depend on his ability to read the intentions of a stranger, and where the difference between wealth and death often came down to nothing more than luck, timing, and the willingness to keep moving forward when everything seemed lost. Looking at the provided references, I'll continue with part 2 of the script about ancient traders, maintaining the same tone, style, and atmospheric quality while exploring their harsh world in greater depth. The coin that lined their purses told only half the story. The other half was written in scars, in the weathered lines around their eyes, in the way they instinctively checked escape routes before sitting down to negotiate. Because while silver might have filled their pockets, it was the invisible currency of information that kept them breathing. Every trader carried maps in their head that no cartographer would ever draw. Not just of roads and mountain passes, but of which tribal leaders could be bought, which ports had been overrun by plague, which governors were skimming tribute from merchant caravans. They knew the price of safe passage through a dozen different kingdoms, the names of reliable guides who wouldn't cut their throats in the night, and the seasonal patterns of bandits who worked the major trade routes, like farmers working their fields. Information flowed through their networks faster than goods. A trader arriving in Damascus might know about a plague outbreak in Constantinople before the local authorities did. They understood which kingdoms were on the verge of war, which currencies were about to be debased, which trade agreements were secretly being negotiated. This intelligence wasn't gathered from official sources. It came from whispered conversations in caravan camps, from the tremor in a portmaster's voice, from the sudden absence of certain goods in certain markets. The smart ones never dealt in information directly. They simply adjusted their routes, their cargo, their timing. A sudden shift toward medical supplies might indicate knowledge of an approaching epidemic. An unusual demand for weapons could signal brewing conflict. The most successful traders read the world like a vast, ever-changing ledger, where every rumor had a price and every secret had commercial value. But this constant flow of intelligence came with its own dangers. Knowledge made you valuable, but it also made you a target. Governments wanted to know what you knew. Competitors wanted to steal your sources. Bandits assumed that if you knew enough to avoid their usual traps, you must be carrying something worth taking. The line between being well-informed and being marked for elimination was razor thin. Trust became the most precious and dangerous commodity of all. A trader's network was built on relationships that could span decades, connections that often outlasted kingdoms and dynasties. But trust had to be carefully rationed. Share too little information and your contacts would find more generous partners. Share too much and you might wake up with a knife between your ribs, your secrets being sold to the highest bidder. The truly successful traders developed an almost supernatural ability to read people. They could spot desperation in a merchant's too eager smile, detect deception in the way someone counted coins, sense opportunity in a governor's casual questions about grain supplies. They learned to speak without saying anything, to listen between the words, to understand the economics of silence. They also understood that in their world, neutrality was both a survival strategy and a moral compromise. A trader might sell grain to a city under siege, while simultaneously providing intelligence about the city's defenses to the besieging army. They justified this by claiming they were merely facilitating the flow of goods and information. But they knew they were often profiting from human misery. The psychological toll was immense. Constant vigilance, endless calculation, the weight of carrying secrets that could topple governments or save lives. Many traders developed a kind of emotional armor, a professional detachment that allowed them to witness suffering without being paralyzed by it. They had to be part diplomat, part spy, part warrior, and part accountant, switching between these roles as smoothly as changing clothes. Some grew cynical, seeing every human interaction as a transaction, every relationship as a potential source of profit or loss. Others became almost mystical, developing an intuitive understanding of the great currents of history, the invisible forces that moved goods, people, and power across the ancient world. The most dangerous traders were those who began to believe they could control these forces rather than simply navigate them. They started wars to create demand for weapons, spread rumors to manipulate prices, toppled rulers who threatened their operations. These men didn't just trade in goods, they traded in the rise and fall of civilizations. Yet for all their power and influence, they remained fundamentally vulnerable. A single bad decision, one misread situation, could destroy decades of careful relationship building. They lived with the constant knowledge that their success was built on foundations as shifting as desert sand, and that the same networks that enriched them could, with breathtaking speed, become the instruments of their destruction. The most successful traders were those who understood that in their harsh world, the only constant was change itself. They didn't fight the chaos. They learned to dance with it, to find profit in uncertainty, to build empires on the very instability that destroyed others. Based on the reference files, I'll create part 3 of the script about ancient traders, maintaining the established tone and style while continuing from where the previous parts left off. The ancient trade routes weren't just paths carved through sand and stone. They were arteries of information, pulsing with secrets more valuable than any cargo. A merchant's survival depended not just on the quality of his goods, but on the quality of his intelligence network. In a world where knowledge meant the difference between profit and death, the most successful traders weren't just moving merchandise. They were moving whispers. Consider the silk roads that snaked through the heart of Asia. These weren't single routes, but sprawling webs of interconnected paths, each one carrying its own risks and rewards. A trader setting out from Constantinople might hear rumors of bandits gathering near Samarkand, or whispers of a plague outbreak closing the passes through the Hindu Kush. This information wasn't freely shared. It was currency, bought with favors, sealed with blood oaths, and hoarded like precious metals. The most cunning merchants cultivated relationships with everyone. Stable boys who overheard conversations, tavern keepers who served wine to loose-tongued officials, caravan guards who'd survived attacks and lived to describe the tactics of their assailants. These weren't casual friendships. They were calculated investments in survival. But information flowed both ways, and the smart trader learned to weaponize what he knew. A merchant might spread false rumors about rich caravans traveling alternative routes, deliberately drawing bandits away from his own path. Others would share selective truths, enough to maintain credibility while keeping the most valuable intelligence for themselves. Trust was a luxury few could afford, yet paradoxically, it was also the foundation upon which all trade was built. The most successful traders developed coded languages, gestures, and symbols that allowed them to communicate complex information without revealing their secrets to competitors or enemies. A particular way of tying a rope, the arrangement of goods in a stall, even the color of a merchant's head wrap could convey crucial intelligence to those who knew how to read the signs. These networks extended far beyond the physical routes. In the great trading cities of the ancient world, Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, Venice, information brokers operated in the shadows of the marketplaces. They were the human equivalent of modern intelligence agencies, collecting, analyzing, and selling knowledge to the highest bidder. A piece of information about troop movements, royal succession disputes, or harvest failures in distant lands could be worth more than a caravan full of silk. The most valuable intelligence concerned what we might call market conditions, but in terms that would make modern economists weep. Which kingdoms were at war, creating demand for weapons and armor? Which regions were experiencing famine, driving up grain prices? Which trade routes had been compromised by bandits or political upheaval? A trader armed with this knowledge could adjust his cargo and route accordingly, arriving at destinations with exactly what people needed most. But the intelligence game was deadly. Too many questions in the wrong places could mark a merchant as a spy. Carrying information between rival kingdoms could result in accusations of treason. And the penalty for being caught with sensitive intelligence was rarely a fine or imprisonment. It was usually death, often preceded by interrogation techniques that would make modern torturers blush. Some traders became so skilled at gathering and analyzing information that they essentially functioned as medieval intelligence officers. They would carry coded messages between distant courts, broker secret negotiations, and even arrange political marriages. These merchant spies operated in a world where commerce and espionage were indistinguishable, where a single piece of information could topple kingdoms or create them. The really sophisticated operators understood that information had to be verified through multiple sources. A rumor heard in one tavern could be deadly if acted upon without confirmation. So they developed networks of cross-references, ways to verify intelligence through independent channels. A report of bandits from a caravan guard might be confirmed by questioning refugees, checking with local authorities, or simply observing the behavior of other merchants. But perhaps the most crucial intelligence concerned human nature itself. Successful traders became expert readers of character, able to assess within minutes whether a potential partner was trustworthy, desperate, or dangerous. They learned to recognize the subtle signs of desperation that might drive someone to betrayal, the markers of wealth that indicated a profitable target, and the tells that revealed hidden agendas. This psychological intelligence extended to understanding entire cultures and regions. A trader needed to know not just what goods were in demand, but why they were in demand, how that demand might shift, and what cultural or political factors might affect it. Spices weren't just flavoring, they were status symbols. Silk wasn't just fabric, it was a statement of power and wealth. Understanding these deeper currents allowed the most successful merchants to anticipate market changes and position themselves accordingly. The ancient world's most legendary traders weren't just moving goods across vast distances. They were operating vast intelligence networks that would make modern corporations envious. They understood that in a world without instant communication, information was the ultimate competitive advantage. And they were willing to risk everything, their fortunes, their reputations, and their lives, to maintain that advantage. Because in the end, the difference between a successful merchant and a dead one wasn't just about having the right goods or choosing the right routes. It was about knowing things that others didn't, understanding the hidden currents that moved beneath the surface of the ancient world, and having the courage to act on that knowledge when the moment came. The traders who mastered this game didn't just survive the harsh realities of ancient commerce. The dangerous truth about ancient traders was hidden in the shadows of ambition and desperation, where fortunes were made and lives were lost in the pursuit of precious cargo. These merchants weren't the romantic figures we imagine today, sailing peacefully across calm seas with holds full of silk and spices. They were hardened survivors operating in a world where trust was a luxury few could afford, and betrayal came as naturally as breathing. By the time we left our story, these traders had already mastered the art of survival through intelligence networks, strategic deception, and an intimate understanding of human nature. But the real darkness lay not in their methods, but in what drove ordinary people to choose such a perilous existence. Because becoming a trader in the ancient world wasn't usually a choice born of adventure or wanderlust. It was often the last resort of the desperate, the dispossessed, and the hunted. Consider Marcus, a fictional but representative trader of the Roman era. Born into a family of modest means in a provincial town, he watched his father's small pottery business crumble under the weight of imperial taxes and corrupt officials. With debts mounting and creditors circling like vultures, Marcus faced a choice that thousands before him had confronted: submit to a life of servitude, flee into the wilderness as an outlaw, or risk everything on the dangerous roads of commerce. The decision wasn't really a decision at all. It was survival wrapped in the thin veneer of opportunity. Marcus's first journey would have been a nightmare of anxiety and ignorance. Ancient trading routes were littered with the bones of optimistic amateurs who thought commerce was simply about buying low and selling high. The reality was far more brutal. Every mile of road held potential disaster. Bandits weren't the romanticized highway robbers of legend. They were desperate, violent men who had often started as failed traders themselves, now surviving by preying on those who still dared to hope. But bandits were just one threat among many. The real danger often came from within the trading parties themselves. Caravans were temporary alliances of convenience, bringing together strangers who shared nothing but mutual suspicion and the common goal of reaching their destination alive. Trust was a commodity more precious than gold, and just as rare. Competition between traders wasn't the genteel rivalry of modern business. It was a blood sport played with smiles and handshakes that could turn deadly without warning. Information was weaponized. False rumors about market conditions could bankrupt a rival. Misleading directions could send competitors into the hands of bandits, or worse. Some traders carried poison as routinely as they carried coins, and not always for their own protection. The successful ones, like our fictional Marcus, learned quickly that survival required a fundamental transformation of character. The honest provincial potter's son had to become something else entirely. He learned to lie with the fluency of a diplomat, to spot deception in the flicker of an eye, to sleep with one hand on his dagger and the other on his purse. Most importantly, he learned that in the world of ancient commerce, mercy was often fatal and ruthlessness was simply good business sense. The psychological toll was immense. Traders developed what we might recognize today as a form of occupational paranoia. Every stranger was a potential threat. Every deal was a potential trap. Every night's rest was a gamble with death. They learned to read people like scrolls, searching for the telltale signs of betrayal, desperation, or opportunity. Their minds became libraries of human weakness, catalogued and cross-referenced for future exploitation. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the trader's life was how it corrupted the very concept of home and family. Successful traders were often absent for months or years at a time. Their children grew up as strangers. Their wives became widows in all but name. And when they did return, they brought with them the paranoia and moral flexibility that had kept them alive on the road. Many traders found that they could no longer distinguish between the personas they adopted for business and their true selves. The masks they wore to survive had become their faces. The lies they told had become their truths. They were wealthy beyond their childhood dreams, but impoverished in ways that gold could never remedy. The ancient world's economy depended on these damaged souls. Every silk robe worn by a Roman senator, every spice that flavored a Byzantine feast, every precious stone that adorned a Persian crown had likely passed through the hands of someone who had sacrificed their humanity for profit. The grand civilizations of antiquity were built, in part, on the broken spirits of those brave or desperate enough to venture into the commercial darkness. And yet, they persisted. Generation after generation of young people, faced with limited options and unlimited ambition, chose the trader's path. Some were driven by greed, others by necessity, but all were united by the fundamental human desire to control their own destiny, even if that control came at a terrible price. The legacy of these ancient merchants echoes through history. They were the pioneers of global commerce, the architects of international law, the creators of the first multinational networks. But they were also the fathers of commercial espionage, the inventors of market manipulation, and the original practitioners of what we might now call economic warfare. Their world was one where information was more valuable than gold, where a single rumor could topple kingdoms, and where the line between legitimate business and outright criminality was often invisible. It was a world that would seem familiar to anyone who has studied the darker corners of modern international commerce, because in many ways, we are still living in the world they created. The harsh truth about ancient traders is that they were both the heroes and villains of their own stories, pioneers and predators, builders and destroyers. They connected continents and cultures, spreading ideas and innovations across vast distances. But they also spread violence, exploitation, and a moral flexibility that would echo through the centuries. In the end, they were products of their time, shaped by forces beyond their control and driven by needs older than civilization itself. The ancient world of trade was a brutal theatre of survival, where merchants operated as much more than simple businessmen. They were strategists, spies, and survivors navigating a landscape where a single miscalculation could mean death, bankruptcy, or worse. These traders weren't the romanticized figures of adventure tales, but hardened individuals who understood that success required mastering not just markets and mathematics, but the darker arts of deception, intelligence gathering, and calculated risk. Consider the reality of a silk merchant preparing for the treacherous journey from Chang'an to Constantinople. This wasn't simply a matter of loading camels and following well-marked roads. Every step required careful orchestration of bribes, guards, and contingency plans. The merchant had to maintain detailed intelligence networks spanning thousands of miles, tracking not just market prices, but political upheavals, bandit movements, seasonal weather patterns, and the shifting loyalties of local warlords who could transform from protector to predator overnight. The psychological toll was immense. Successful traders developed a peculiar form of paranoia that bordered on madness, yet kept them alive. They learned to read the micro-expressions of customs officials, to detect the subtle changes in a city's atmosphere that signaled impending violence, and to maintain multiple false identities across different regions. A spice trader might be known as Ahmad the Pious in Damascus, Dmitri the Scholar in Byzantium, and Wei the Silent in Samarkand, each persona carefully crafted with its own backstory, connections, and behavioral patterns. The information trade was perhaps more valuable than any physical commodity. Merchants didn't just carry silk and spices, they transported intelligence about troop movements, political marriages, crop failures, and technological innovations. A trader who knew that a drought had destroyed the saffron harvest in Kashmir could manipulate prices across 3 continents, while information about a new military alliance could determine which routes remained safe and which led to certain death. These traders operated in a world where trust was both essential and potentially fatal. They formed complex networks of relationships that resembled modern criminal organizations more than legitimate businesses. There were blood oaths, ritual ceremonies, and intricate codes of honor that governed behavior. Betrayal wasn't just bad for business. It was a death sentence that could be carried out years later, and thousands of miles away from the original transgression. The most successful merchants understood that violence was not just a risk to be managed, but a tool to be wielded strategically. They maintained private armies, cultivated relationships with assassins, and weren't above orchestrating the mysterious disappearance of competitors. A trader who discovered a new source of rare pearls might arrange for rival merchants to suffer unfortunate accidents rather than risk competition driving down prices. The emotional and moral complexity of this world is staggering. These were individuals who might spend months caring for sick animals and fellow travelers during a caravan journey, displaying genuine compassion and solidarity, only to coldly manipulate grain prices during a famine, knowing their actions would lead to widespread starvation. They lived with the constant knowledge that their prosperity was often built upon others' suffering. Yet this awareness didn't necessarily make them cruel. It made them pragmatic in ways that modern minds struggle to comprehend. The ancient trade networks were also breeding grounds for innovation in human psychology and social manipulation. Traders developed sophisticated techniques for reading people, understanding cultural nuances, and adapting their personalities to different societies. They were among the first true internationalists, equally comfortable negotiating with Roman senators, Chinese mandarins, and Bedouin chieftains. This adaptability required a kind of psychological flexibility that bordered on multiple personality disorder. The legacy of these ancient traders extends far beyond their economic contributions. They were the first global citizens, the first individuals to truly understand that the world was interconnected in ways that transcended political boundaries. Their networks of trust, information, and mutual obligation created the foundation for international law, banking systems, and diplomatic protocols that persist today. Yet their story is also a reminder of how little human nature has changed. The same drives for profit, security, and dominance that motivated a Roman grain merchant or an Arab pearl trader continue to shape international commerce today. The methods have evolved, become more sophisticated, and ostensibly more civilized, but the fundamental dynamics remain unchanged. These ancient traders were pioneers not just of commerce, but of a particular kind of human consciousness, one that could hold multiple contradictions simultaneously, that could be both ruthlessly practical and surprisingly idealistic, that understood both the necessity of cooperation and the inevitability of conflict. Ancient traders weren't romantic adventurers sailing off into golden sunsets. They were the desperate, the cunning, and the ruthlessly practical, operating in a world where a single miscalculation could mean death, bankruptcy, or worse. By the time merchants reached their middle years, those who had survived carried scars both visible and hidden. Their hands bore the calluses of rope burns and weapon grips. Their eyes held the wariness of men who had learned to sleep with one ear always listening for approaching footsteps. The psychological toll was perhaps even heavier than the physical one. Years of constant vigilance, of reading faces for signs of betrayal, of calculating risks where human lives hung in the balance, created a particular kind of mental exhaustion. Many traders developed what we might recognize today as symptoms of chronic stress. Sleep became elusive, haunted by memories of close calls and lost companions. Trust became a luxury they could no longer afford, even with family members. Some sought solace in wine or other substances, dulling the sharp edges of their hypervigilance. Others became obsessively religious, seeking divine protection for ventures that seemed to mock the very concept of safety. A few simply walked away, abandoning lucrative careers because the weight of constant danger had finally become unbearable. They would settle in quiet towns, opening small shops or teaching their skills to younger men, but their eyes never quite lost that distant look of someone who had seen too much. The truly successful long-term traders were often those who had learned to compartmentalize their emotions, to treat violence and loss as simply another cost of doing business. They developed an almost supernatural ability to assess character within moments of meeting someone, to spot potential threats before they materialized, to navigate complex social situations where saying the wrong thing could prove fatal. These skills served them well in their profession, but often made it difficult to form genuine human connections outside of it. Family relationships suffered under the strain. Wives grew tired of husbands who jumped at sudden noises and insisted on sleeping with weapons within reach. Children learned to fear their father's sudden departures and to dread the news that might accompany their returns. Many trader families developed their own codes and signals, ways of communicating danger without alerting potential enemies who might be watching or listening. The irony was that the very traits that made someone successful as an ancient trader, paranoia, ruthlessness, emotional detachment, often made them unsuited for the peaceful retirement they were theoretically working toward. Men who had spent decades treating every stranger as a potential threat found it nearly impossible to simply enjoy a conversation with a neighbor. Those who had learned to strike first and ask questions later struggled with the ordinary negotiations of daily life. Yet despite these profound costs, the ancient trade networks continued to function, driven by men and women who were willing to pay the price in blood, sanity, and human connection for the chance to accumulate wealth and power. They understood that civilization itself depended on their willingness to brave the unknown, to carry goods and ideas across hostile territories, to serve as the connective tissue that bound distant cultures together. The merchants who survived long enough to tell their tales often spoke of a strange addiction to the life, despite its horrors. There was something intoxicating about operating at the very edge of survival, about matching wits with bandits and bureaucrats, about the rush of completing a dangerous transaction and living to count the profits. Many who tried to retire found themselves drawn back to the trade routes, unable to settle into the quiet rhythms of ordinary life. These were the hidden costs of ancient commerce, the human price paid for every luxury good that reached distant markets, for every exotic spice that graced a wealthy table, for every piece of fine silk that adorned a noble's wardrobe. Behind every successful trading venture lay a trail of broken men, shattered families, and communities forever altered by the violence and corruption that followed in the merchant's wake. The ancient world's economy was built on the backs of these damaged souls, men and women who had traded pieces of their humanity for the promise of wealth and the thin hope of eventual security. The world of ancient traders was a realm where survival depended not merely on moving goods from one place to another, but on navigating an intricate web of trust, deception, and calculated risk that could determine whether you returned home wealthy or never returned at all. These merchants operated in the shadows between civilizations, where information was as valuable as gold, and where a single misjudgment could cost everything. In the bustling markets of ancient Babylon, a successful trader named Ashur-dan learned early that the most profitable routes were often the most perilous. As he prepared for another journey along the Silk Road, he understood that his cargo of precious spices and silk would attract not only legitimate buyers, but also bandits, corrupt officials, and rival merchants who might pay handsomely for advanced knowledge of his route. The art of trading in the ancient world required mastering what we might call commercial espionage. Every trader worth his salt maintained a network of informants scattered across the known world. These weren't formal spies in the modern sense, but rather a loose confederation of dock workers, innkeepers, caravan guards, and fellow merchants who traded information as readily as they traded goods. A tip about political unrest in a distant kingdom could mean the difference between arriving to find profitable markets or walking into a war zone where your merchandise might be confiscated and your life forfeit. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was immense. Successful traders developed an almost paranoid awareness of their surroundings, learning to read the subtle signs that might indicate danger or opportunity. They studied the faces of strangers, listened carefully to tavern gossip, and paid close attention to which routes other merchants avoided. This heightened state of alertness became second nature, but it came at the cost of genuine human connection. Trust was perhaps the most valuable and dangerous commodity in the ancient trading world. Merchants formed partnerships that might last decades, built on nothing more than handshake agreements and shared profits. Yet these same relationships could turn deadly when large sums were at stake. The betrayal of a trusted partner was not merely a business setback, but often a death sentence, as the betrayed trader might find himself stranded in hostile territory without allies or resources. The physical dangers were only part of the challenge. Ancient traders also had to navigate the complex political landscapes of multiple kingdoms and empires, each with its own laws, customs, and expectations. A gesture that showed respect in one culture might be considered insulting in another. Currency that was accepted in one region might be worthless just a few hundred miles away. Smart traders became amateur diplomats and anthropologists, studying the customs and languages of their trading partners with the dedication of scholars. Women in the ancient trading world faced additional layers of complexity and danger. While some cultures allowed women to participate in commerce, they often had to work through male intermediaries or adopt masculine personas to conduct business safely. The legendary Queen Dido of Carthage began as a trader before founding her kingdom, but her path required navigating not only commercial challenges, but also the gender expectations of ancient Mediterranean society. The constant movement required by trading took its toll on family life. Many successful merchants spent more time on the road than at home, missing births, deaths, and the daily rhythms of domestic life. Their children often grew up as strangers, and marriages strained under the pressure of long separations, and the ever-present risk that a spouse might never return from a trading expedition. Some traders solved this problem by maintaining families in multiple cities, but this created its own complications and ethical dilemmas. Ancient traders also had to master the art of negotiation in ways that went far beyond simple haggling over prices. They needed to understand the psychological motivations of their trading partners, reading between the lines to determine what a potential buyer truly wanted and how desperate they were to obtain it. This required developing skills in reading body language, understanding cultural contexts, and sometimes employing outright manipulation to close deals. The accumulation of wealth through trading created its own set of problems. Successful merchants became targets for theft, kidnapping, and extortion. They had to find ways to store and protect their wealth while maintaining the mobility necessary for their trade. Some buried caches of gold and silver along their regular routes, creating a network of hidden wealth that only they knew about. Others invested in property or business ventures in multiple cities, diversifying their holdings to protect against total loss. The moral compromises required by ancient trading could be staggering. Merchants regularly dealt in goods that we would consider ethically problematic today, including slaves, weapons, and luxury items produced through exploitation. They often had to choose between profit and principle, and the pressures of survival in a harsh commercial environment usually favored those willing to set aside moral qualms in pursuit of wealth. Disease was a constant companion on ancient trade routes. Merchants traveling long distances were exposed to illnesses their bodies had never encountered, and they often served as unwitting carriers of plague and pestilence between distant regions. The close quarters of caravans and ships made the spread of disease almost inevitable, and many trading expeditions were decimated by illness long before they reached their destinations. As these ancient traders aged, they faced the challenge of transitioning from active commerce to a more sedentary life. Unlike modern business people, they couldn't simply retire and live off investments. Their wealth was tied up in relationships, roots, and knowledge that required constant maintenance. Many tried to pass their businesses to sons or trusted apprentices, but the personal relationships and insider knowledge that made them successful were difficult to transfer. The transition often marked the beginning of a slow decline in both wealth and relevance. The legacy of these ancient traders extends far beyond their individual stories of survival and success. They were the threads that wove disparate civilizations together, carrying not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices across vast distances. Their willingness to endure hardship and risk in pursuit of profit helped create the first truly global economy, laying the foundation for the interconnected world we know today. Looking at these reference files, I can see the style is contemplative, immersive, and methodical, perfect for a sleep-focused audience. Here's part 8 of your script. Yet the most treacherous aspect of ancient trade wasn't the physical dangers, or even the political minefields. It was the slow, grinding erosion of the soul that came with years of calculated deception and moral compromise. The successful trader learned to compartmentalize their humanity, to view every relationship through the lens of potential profit or loss. Trust became a currency to be spent wisely, empathy a luxury they couldn't afford. Consider the psychological toll of maintaining multiple identities across different cities. In Damascus, you were Ahmad, the silk merchant, devout and humble. In Constantinople, you became Dmitri, the spice trader, with different mannerisms, different stories, different loyalties. In Venice, perhaps Giuseppe, speaking of family vineyards that never existed. Each persona required its own carefully constructed backstory, its own network of lies that had to remain consistent across years of trading relationships. The mental gymnastics were exhausting. Traders developed elaborate systems of remembering which stories they'd told to whom, which debts were real and which were fabricated for negotiation purposes. Some kept coded journals, writing in scripts only they could decipher. Others relied on trusted associates who served as living repositories of their various deceptions. The fear of contradiction was constant. One slip of the tongue, one misremembered detail, could unravel years of careful relationship building. Sleep came fitfully to these men. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the masks could finally slip away, many found themselves staring at unfamiliar ceilings, wondering who they really were beneath all the carefully constructed personas. The line between performance and reality blurred until some traders lost themselves entirely in their own deceptions. Family relationships suffered under the weight of this psychological burden. How do you explain to a wife why you flinch when she touches you unexpectedly? How do you teach your children about honesty when your livelihood depends on elaborate lies? Many traders became emotionally distant, viewing even their closest relationships through the calculating lens they developed for business. Love became another transaction, trust another commodity to be managed. The isolation was profound. Even among other merchants, true friendship was rare. Everyone understood that their companions would betray them for the right price, just as they would do the same. Conversations were careful dances of half-truths and strategic omissions. Genuine laughter became a forgotten luxury, replaced by the practiced chuckles that smoothed business negotiations. Some traders sought solace in philosophy or religion, desperately trying to justify their actions through higher purposes. They convinced themselves they were civilizing barbarians, spreading culture and knowledge along with their goods. The silk they sold wasn't just fabric, it was beauty, artistry, a connection to distant lands. The spices weren't mere seasonings, they were medicine, preservation, life itself. These mental frameworks provided temporary comfort, but the underlying moral weight remained. Others simply embraced the darkness, becoming what their profession demanded. They cultivated reputations for ruthlessness, understanding that fear could be more valuable than friendship. These were the traders who slept soundly, having made peace with their choices. They moved through the world like predators, efficient and emotionless, leaving broken partnerships and abandoned allies in their wake. The physical manifestations of this psychological stress were numerous. Chronic headaches plagued many long-distance traders, their minds constantly calculating risks and remembering lies. Digestive problems were common, the result of years of tension and irregular eating. Hands developed nervous tics, unconsciously checking for concealed weapons or counting invisible coins. Eyes became perpetually watchful, never quite relaxing even in supposedly safe spaces. Language itself became a weapon in the trader's arsenal. They learned to speak in layers, with surface meanings for casual listeners and deeper implications for those who knew how to interpret the code. A comment about the weather might actually be intelligence about military movements. Praise for a rival's goods could be a subtle warning about their character. Even silence became eloquent, conveying messages that words could not safely express. The successful trader developed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to detect deception in others while maintaining their own facades. They learned to recognize the micro-expressions that betrayed fear, greed, or dishonesty. This skill was survival. But it came at the cost of ever being able to take anyone at face value again. Even genuine kindness became suspect, analyzed for hidden motives and ulterior purposes. Memory became both blessing and curse. The trader's mind was a vast repository of faces, names, debts, and favors, but also of betrayals, losses, and moral compromises. They carried the weight of every unethical decision, every relationship sacrificed for profit, every moment when they chose commerce over conscience. These memories accumulated like sediment, gradually burying whatever idealistic young person had first ventured into the world of trade. Yet perhaps most tragic was how this psychological transformation affected their perception of beauty and wonder. The same sunset that once filled them with awe now merely indicated time passing, profits lost or gained. The exotic foods that once excited their palate became mere inventory to be evaluated and priced. The strange customs and fascinating cultures they encountered were reduced to obstacles or opportunities for exploitation. The ancient trader's journey was ultimately one of profound loneliness, walking between worlds but belonging to none, trusted by few and trusting fewer still. They carried civilization on their backs while slowly losing their own humanity in the process. The harsh world of ancient traders was a realm where survival often meant navigating not just physical dangers, but psychological minefields that could destroy a person's soul. As the last rays of sunlight faded over distant mountain passes, these merchants faced a different kind of peril, one that crept through their minds like poison through water. The mental toll of constant deception was perhaps the most insidious threat of all. Traders learned early that truth was a luxury they couldn't afford. Every conversation was a performance, every smile calculated, every gesture measured for its potential advantage. They wore masks so often that many forgot what lay beneath. In the bazaars of Samarkand or the harbours of Alexandria, a merchant might present himself as a devout pilgrim to one client, a worldly sophisticate to another, and a humble craftsman to a third, all within the span of a single afternoon. This endless charade extracted a terrible price. Many traders reported feeling disconnected from their own identity, as if they were actors who had forgotten their real lines. They spoke of waking in the night, unsure which version of themselves was genuine. Some developed what we might recognize today as dissociative episodes, moments where they felt like strangers observing their own lives from a distance. The isolation was equally devastating. Trust became an extinct emotion in their vocabulary. They couldn't confide in fellow merchants who were competitors and potential enemies. They couldn't be honest with their families, who would be horrified by the moral compromises required for survival. They couldn't even trust their own servants or guards completely, knowing that loyalty was often just another commodity to be bought and sold. Many turned to substances for escape. Opium from the East, wine from the Mediterranean, or locally brewed intoxicants provided temporary refuge from the constant vigilance their profession demanded. But these offered only hollow comfort, often creating new dependencies that made them even more vulnerable to exploitation. The psychological warfare of the trade routes was sophisticated and brutal. Competitors didn't just undercut prices or spread rumors about product quality. They launched calculated attacks on a trader's mental state. They might hire actors to pose as customers and make demands that seemed reasonable but were designed to drive a merchant to distraction. They could arrange for disturbing messages to be delivered at crucial moments, throwing off negotiations. Some even employed what were essentially early forms of psychological torture, using sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and emotional harassment to break down rivals. Sleep became another casualty. The combination of physical danger and mental stress created a perpetual state of hypervigilance. Many traders developed chronic insomnia, lying awake, calculating routes, counting profits, or simply staring into the darkness while their minds raced through endless scenarios of betrayal and disaster. When they did sleep, nightmares were common, filled with visions of lost caravans, empty warehouses, or the faces of those they had deceived or abandoned. The weight of moral compromise accumulated like sediment in their souls. Each small dishonesty, every betrayal of trust, every moment they chose profit over principle, added another layer to the burden they carried. They might start their careers believing they could maintain their integrity while succeeding in trade. But the market had a way of grinding down such noble intentions. They learned to rationalize their actions, telling themselves that everyone else was doing the same, that survival justified any means, that their families needed the money regardless of how it was earned. Some developed elaborate mental compartments, convincing themselves that their professional persona was completely separate from their true self. They might be ruthless negotiators by day and loving fathers by night, never allowing the two roles to acknowledge each other. But the human psyche isn't designed for such division, and the strain often manifested in unexpected ways. Sudden rages, inexplicable melancholy, or periods of complete emotional numbness. The constant exposure to human suffering also took its toll. Traders witnessed slavery, poverty, disease, and violence as routine parts of their environment. They learned to step over beggars, ignore cries for help, and conduct business while people suffered around them. This necessary callousness often spread beyond their professional lives, making them increasingly unable to form genuine emotional connections with anyone. Paranoia became a survival skill that metastasized into a way of life. They scrutinized every word for hidden meaning, analyzed every gesture for signs of deception, and assumed the worst of every situation. This hypervigilance might keep them alive on the trade routes, but it made normal human relationships nearly impossible. They couldn't enjoy a simple conversation without wondering what the other person wanted from them, couldn't accept kindness without suspecting ulterior motives. The psychological pressure was so intense that some traders simply snapped. Records from various periods describe merchants who suddenly abandoned their caravans and walked into the desert, or who gave away their entire fortunes to beggars, or who retreated into complete silence and never spoke again. These weren't necessarily signs of madness, but perhaps of minds that had finally reached their breaking point under the relentless strain of their chosen profession. Yet even as their mental health deteriorated, they often couldn't stop. The combination of potential wealth, the adrenaline of danger, and the fear of poverty created a psychological trap that was nearly impossible to escape. They were addicted to the very lifestyle that was destroying them, caught in patterns they recognized as destructive, but felt powerless to change. The most successful traders often developed what could only be described as a split personality. They became masters of emotional regulation, able to switch between charm and ruthlessness, generosity and greed, fear and confidence as the situation demanded. But this adaptability came at the cost of authentic selfhood. They became human chameleons, so skilled at becoming what others needed them to be, that they lost track of who they actually were. This psychological fragmentation was perhaps the greatest tragedy of the ancient trade world. These men and women, who connected civilizations and spread knowledge across continents, often lost themselves in the process. They carried goods from one culture to another, but they carried their own wounded spirits with them everywhere, unable to find a place where they could finally set down their burdens and simply be human again. The lives of ancient traders were a relentless battleground of survival, yet their struggles shaped the very foundations of our interconnected world. These merchants, who operated in the shadows between civilizations, faced dangers that would make modern entrepreneurs grateful for their cubicles and quarterly reports. Trust was perhaps the scarcest commodity in their world. Every handshake might conceal a dagger. Every smile might mask betrayal. Traders developed elaborate networks of informants and allies. But even these relationships were fragile, built on mutual benefit rather than genuine loyalty. Information became as valuable as gold or spices, carefully guarded and strategically shared. A merchant who knew which routes were safe, which officials could be bribed, or which markets were about to collapse held power that could mean the difference between prosperity and poverty. The psychological toll of this existence was crushing. Chronic stress became a constant companion as traders navigated political upheavals, natural disasters, and the ever-present threat of violence. They learned to compartmentalize their emotions, to sleep with one eye open, and to trust no one completely. Many developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of trauma, hypervigilance and paranoia that, while adaptive in their dangerous world, slowly eroded their capacity for genuine human connection. Yet perhaps most disturbing was the gradual erosion of moral boundaries that survival demanded. Traders often found themselves complicit in slavery, dealing in weapons that would fuel conflicts or exploiting desperate populations. The ethical compromises required for success in this world created a peculiar form of spiritual exhaustion. Many merchants spoke of feeling hollow inside, as if the constant moral flexibility had worn away their sense of right and wrong. The physical demands were equally punishing. Long journeys on foot or by caravan left traders with chronic pain from injuries that never properly healed. Exposure to diseases in foreign lands claimed many lives, while poor nutrition and contaminated water were constant threats. Sleep deprivation was routine, whether from standing watch during dangerous passages or from the anxiety that made rest elusive even in relatively safe havens. Family relationships suffered enormously under these pressures. Traders were often absent for months or years at a time, returning home as strangers to their own children. Wives and families lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing if their loved one would return from the next journey. The emotional distance that traders cultivated for survival often made genuine intimacy impossible, even with those they loved most. Despite these overwhelming costs, ancient traders were the unsung architects of human progress. They carried more than goods across continents. They transported ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that would transform entire civilizations. The mathematical concepts that enabled navigation, the preservation techniques that allowed food to travel vast distances, the diplomatic protocols that made peaceful trade possible. All of these innovations emerged from the crucible of merchant necessity. Their networks became the nervous system of the ancient world, connecting distant civilizations and creating the first truly global economy. When a plague devastated silk production in China, the effects rippled through markets in Rome. When new trade routes opened, they could shift the balance of power between entire empires. These merchants were inadvertent diplomats, often serving as the primary contact between cultures that might otherwise have remained forever isolated. The legacy of these ancient traders extends far beyond commerce. They established the principles of international law, created the first credit systems, and developed the logistical frameworks that modern supply chains still rely upon. Their innovations in communication, transportation, and risk management laid the groundwork for our interconnected world. But perhaps their greatest contribution was simply proving that human beings could cooperate across vast distances and cultural divides. In an age when most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, traders demonstrated that mutual benefit could overcome language barriers, religious differences, and political hostilities. They showed that strangers could become partners, that foreign customs could be learned and respected, and that prosperity could be shared rather than hoarded. The ancient trader's life was one of constant calculation, weighing potential profits against probable dangers, immediate gains against long-term relationships, personal safety against professional obligations. They lived in a world where a single mistake could mean death, bankruptcy, or exile, yet they persisted because they understood something fundamental about human nature. People everywhere wanted the same basic things: security for their families, prosperity for their communities, and access to the wonders that lay beyond their horizons. These merchants became the bridges between worlds, carrying not just silk and spices, but dreams and possibilities. They paid for this privilege with their health, their relationships, and often their lives. Yet without their sacrifice, without their willingness to venture into the unknown and endure the unendurable, our modern world of instant communication and global commerce would never have existed. The harsh reality of ancient trading was that it demanded everything from those who pursued it, offering no guarantees and little mercy. As the Mediterranean sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the docks of ancient ports, merchants prepared for journeys that would test every fibre of their being. These weren't casual traders peddling goods at local markets. These were the backbone of ancient commerce, men and women who risked everything to move precious cargo across hostile territories, treacherous seas, and through kingdoms where a wrong word could mean death. The life of an ancient trader was a delicate balance between calculation and chaos. Every decision carried weight: which route to take, which guards to trust, how much to reveal about their cargo. A successful merchant needed the mind of a mathematician, the instincts of a spy, and the courage of a warrior. Because in the ancient world, commerce wasn't just about profit, it was about survival. Consider the Silk Road traders who spent months crossing the Taklamakan Desert, where sandstorms could bury entire caravans without warning. Or the Phoenician merchants who navigated by stars across the Mediterranean, never knowing if pirates lurked beyond the next island. These traders didn't just transport goods. They carried the lifeblood of civilizations, connecting distant cultures through networks of trust, desperation, and mutual need. But the harsh reality was that most traders lived on the edge of ruin. A single shipwreck, a political upheaval, or even a change in seasonal weather patterns could destroy decades of careful planning. They operated in a world where contracts were sealed with handshakes, where reputation was more valuable than gold, and where betrayal was as common as morning bread. The psychological toll was immense. Constant vigilance wore down even the strongest minds. Traders developed elaborate codes for communication, paranoid habits for protecting their goods, and an almost supernatural ability to read the intentions of strangers. They learned to sleep with one eye open, to taste their food for poison, and to maintain multiple escape routes from every situation. Many traders carried scars, both visible and hidden. Physical wounds from bandit attacks, disease contracted in foreign ports, or injuries sustained during desperate escapes. But the invisible wounds ran deeper. The isolation of months on dangerous roads, the weight of responsibility for crew members' lives, and the constant moral compromises required to navigate corrupt officials and hostile territories. Yet these merchants were also the unsung heroes of human progress. They didn't just move spices and silks. They transported ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that would reshape entire civilizations. A trader might carry Chinese gunpowder to Europe, Islamic mathematics to India, or Greek philosophy to distant kingdoms. They were living bridges between worlds that might otherwise never touch. The accumulation of wealth came at tremendous personal cost. Successful traders often became wealthy beyond imagination, but they paid for it with broken families, damaged relationships, and haunted memories. They might return home after years of travel to find their children grown, their spouses remarried, or their communities changed beyond recognition. The networks these traders built were marvels of human organization. Without modern communication, they created systems of credit, insurance, and information sharing that spanned continents. A merchant in Damascus could send goods to a partner in Cairo, knowing that payment would eventually reach him through a chain of trusted intermediaries. These networks required an almost religious faith in human nature, combined with ruthless pragmatism about human weakness. Ancient traders also became masters of languages, customs, and diplomatic nuance. A successful merchant might speak 6 languages, understand the religious practices of a dozen cultures, and navigate the political sensitivities of competing kingdoms. They were cultural chameleons, adapting their appearance, mannerisms, and even beliefs to blend into whatever environment they found themselves in. The legacy of these ancient traders extends far beyond their individual lives. They laid the foundation for the modern global economy, established trade routes that are still used today, and created cultural exchanges that enriched human civilization. Their willingness to risk everything for the promise of profit and adventure helped weave the world together, one dangerous journey at a time. In the end, the harsh world of ancient traders was a crucible that forged some of history's most resilient and adaptable human beings. They sacrificed comfort, safety, and often their humanity in pursuit of wealth and the thrill of connection across vast distances. As the golden age of antiquity's greatest trade routes faded into memory, leaving behind only whispered legends of silk-laden caravans and spice-heavy ships, a new chapter in the merchant's tale began to unfold. The medieval period brought with it fresh challenges, darker perils, and perhaps, most cunningly of all, an entirely new breed of trader. These were not merely the successors to ancient merchants. They were something altogether more complex, more desperate, and infinitely more dangerous. The collapse of the Roman Empire had shattered the great trade networks that once connected distant continents like veins carrying lifeblood through a vast body. Where once Roman legions had protected merchant convoys, now bandits roamed freely. Where once standardized currencies had facilitated smooth transactions across vast territories, now a bewildering maze of local coinages, weights, and measures complicated every exchange. The merchant who had once relied on imperial protection and established routes now found himself truly alone, navigating a world that had grown darker, more fragmented, and infinitely more hostile. Medieval traders were not simply continuing the work of their ancient predecessors, they were reinventing commerce itself in a world that seemed determined to crush it entirely. The great trading cities of antiquity lay in ruins or had dwindled to shadows of their former selves. Alexandria, once the jewel of Mediterranean commerce, struggled under successive conquests. Constantinople, though still magnificent, was increasingly isolated. The great roads that had carried Roman merchants safely across continents were now crumbling paths haunted by brigands and wolves. Into this shattered landscape stepped a new kind of merchant. These were men and women born not of privilege and ancient trading families, but of necessity and desperation. They were the survivors, the adapters, the ones willing to risk everything for the chance to rebuild what had been lost. They carried with them not just goods, but something far more precious and dangerous, the dream of reconnecting a fractured world. The medieval trader's journey began not in the comfortable counting houses of established merchants, but in the smoking ruins of collapsed empires. They learned their craft not from inherited wisdom, but from bitter experience. Every transaction was a negotiation with death. Every journey was a gamble with forces both human and supernatural. They traded not just in silk and spices, but in survival itself. These new merchants faced challenges, their ancient counterparts could never have imagined. The rise of feudalism had created a patchwork of petty kingdoms, each with its own laws, customs, and currencies. A merchant might cross a dozen borders in a single day's travel, each requiring different tolls, different protocols, different forms of deference to local lords who viewed traders with a mixture of greed and suspicion. The Church, now the dominant force in European society, viewed commerce with deep ambivalence. Profit was suspect, lending at interest was sin, and the accumulation of wealth was seen as a barrier to salvation. Merchants found themselves caught between the necessity of their trade and the condemnation of their souls. They developed elaborate theological justifications for their activities, funded religious institutions, and sought absolution for the very activities that made such funding possible. But perhaps most significantly, the medieval trader had to contend with a world that had grown genuinely more dangerous. The protective umbrella of imperial power was gone. In its place was a chaotic landscape of competing authorities, none strong enough to guarantee safe passage, but all powerful enough to demand tribute. Bandits were no longer the exception, but the rule. Pirates controlled vital sea routes. Even the weather seemed more hostile, as the medieval warm period gave way to increasingly unpredictable climate patterns. The merchants' response to these challenges was nothing short of revolutionary. Unable to rely on external protection, they began to organize themselves. The great merchant guilds of the medieval period were not simply trade associations. They were mutual defense pacts, intelligence networks, and quasi-military organizations, all rolled into one. They established their own courts, their own laws, and their own systems of justice. In many ways, they became states within states, exercising power that rivaled that of kings and princes. These medieval traders also developed new financial instruments that would lay the foundation for modern capitalism. The letter of credit, the bill of exchange, sophisticated accounting methods, and even early forms of insurance all emerged from the practical needs of merchants operating in an uncertain world. They created banking networks that spanned continents, allowing money to flow safely across borders, even when goods could not. But innovation came at a price. The medieval merchant lived in a state of constant anxiety that would have driven their ancient predecessors to madness. They were simultaneously essential to society and despised by it. They were wealthy beyond the dreams of most, yet their wealth was always precarious, always subject to confiscation by lords, kings, or the church. They were cosmopolitan and cultured, yet forced to present themselves as humble and pious to avoid accusations of pride and avarice. The psychological toll was immense. Medieval merchants suffered from what we might now recognize as chronic stress disorders. They developed elaborate rituals and superstitions to cope with the uncertainty of their lives. They became obsessive about record keeping, not just for business purposes, but as a way of imposing order on a chaotic world. They formed intense, almost familial bonds with their trading partners, creating networks of trust that spanned vast distances and cultural divides. These traders also had to navigate the complex web of medieval social hierarchy. Unlike their ancient counterparts, who had often enjoyed high social status, medieval merchants occupied an ambiguous position in society. They were neither nobles nor peasants, neither clergy nor warriors. They were something new, something that didn't fit neatly into the established order. This outsider status gave them certain advantages, allowing them to move between social groups and cultures in ways that others could not. But it also made them perpetual targets of suspicion and hostility. The merchant's relationship with power was particularly complex, unlike ancient traders who had operated within established imperial systems. Medieval merchants often found themselves creating the very frameworks within which they operated. They negotiated directly with kings and princes, not as subjects seeking permission, but as equals offering mutual benefit. They funded wars, supported religious institutions, and even influenced the selection of popes and emperors. This power came with extraordinary risks. A merchant who grew too wealthy or too influential might find himself accused of treason, heresy, or simple greed. The line between success and destruction was razor thin, and many of the most successful medieval merchants ended their lives in exile, poverty, or worse. The Medici banking empire, perhaps the most successful merchant enterprise of the medieval period, saw family members murdered, exiled, and excommunicated even as they reached the heights of wealth and influence. The daily life of a medieval merchant was a carefully choreographed dance with danger. Every morning brought fresh reports of wars, plagues, and disasters that could destroy carefully laid plans. Weather patterns that might delay a shipment could mean bankruptcy. Political changes in distant lands could render valuable trade agreements worthless overnight. The merchant had to be part businessman, part diplomat, part spy, and part warrior. Their homes reflected this complexity. Medieval merchant houses were simultaneously showcases of wealth and fortresses against attack. They were designed to impress potential partners and intimidate potential enemies. Hidden passages, secret rooms, and concealed safes were standard features. Many merchant families maintained private armies and intelligence networks that rivaled those of minor princes. The merchant's family life was equally complex. Marriages were typically arranged to cement business alliances, linking trading families across vast distances. Children were educated not just in letters and numbers, but in languages, customs, and the subtle arts of negotiation and diplomacy. Sons were sent on trading missions from a young age, learning the family business through direct experience with its dangers and rewards. Daughters, while formally excluded from direct participation in trade, often wielded enormous behind-the-scenes influence, managing household finances that could exceed the treasuries of small kingdoms. The relationship between medieval merchants and the emerging banking system was revolutionary. Unlike ancient traders who had primarily dealt in physical goods, medieval merchants began to trade in abstract concepts, credit, debt, and risk itself. They developed sophisticated understanding of currency fluctuations, interest rates, and market dynamics that would not look out of place in a modern business school. But this financial sophistication came with spiritual costs. The church's prohibition on usury forced merchants to develop increasingly elaborate schemes to disguise interest payments as legitimate business expenses. They became experts in moral theology, arguing with priests and bishops about the precise definition of sinful profit. Some of the most important theological developments of the medieval period emerged from these debates between merchants and clergy about the morality of commerce. The psychological pressure of operating in this moral grey area was enormous. Medieval merchants often suffered from severe anxiety about the state of their souls. They made elaborate charitable donations, funded religious institutions, and went on pilgrimages in attempts to balance their spiritual ledgers. Some abandoned commerce entirely in old age, entering monasteries or convents in hopes of achieving salvation. Yet for all these challenges, medieval traders achieved something remarkable. They rebuilt the global trading networks that had been shattered by the fall of Rome. They connected Europe to Asia, Africa to the Americas, creating the first truly global economy. They financed the Renaissance, funded the Age of Exploration, and laid the groundwork for the modern world. The legacy of these medieval merchants extends far beyond commerce. They were among the first Europeans to develop genuinely cosmopolitan worldviews, learning languages, adopting customs, and forming friendships across cultural and religious boundaries. They were often more tolerant of religious and cultural differences than the clergy who condemned them for their avarice. Their trading posts became centers of cultural exchange, spreading not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and artistic styles across vast distances. The Italian merchant princes of the Renaissance, the Hanseatic League traders of northern Europe, the Islamic merchants who connected Africa to Asia, and the Byzantine traders who maintained links between East and West, all shared certain characteristics. They were risk-takers, innovators, and survivors. They operated in the spaces between established authorities, creating their own rules and their own forms of order. These merchants also played crucial roles in the development of urban civilization. The great trading cities of the medieval period, Venice, Genoa, Florence, Bruges, and Hamburg, were essentially merchant republics. They developed new forms of government, new legal systems, and new cultural institutions. They were laboratories for political and economic innovation that would influence the development of modern democracy and capitalism. The decline of medieval trading systems came not from internal failures, but from external changes. The rise of powerful centralized monarchies reduced the autonomy of merchant cities. The development of oceanic trade routes bypassed traditional overland networks. The Protestant Reformation disrupted established financial and commercial relationships. The discovery of the New World created new opportunities, but also new competitors. But the spirit of the medieval merchant lived on. The entrepreneurs who funded the Age of Exploration, the banking families who financed the Industrial Revolution, and the commercial pioneers who built the modern global economy all trace their intellectual and financial lineage back to these medieval innovators. The harsh world of medieval traders was not just about survival and profit. It was about the fundamental human drive to connect, to exchange, to build relationships across the boundaries that divide us. These merchants were not just moving goods across continents. They were weaving the fabric of human civilization itself, thread by thread, transaction by transaction. In the end, the medieval trader's greatest achievement was not any particular fortune accumulated or route established, but the demonstration that human ingenuity and determination could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. They proved that even in the darkest of times, when empires fall and civilizations collapse, the human spirit of enterprise and connection will find a way to rebuild and reconnect the world. Their story reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that the connections we take for granted today were built by individuals willing to risk everything for the chance to build something better. They faced a world that seemed determined to remain fragmented and isolated, and through their courage, cunning, and sheer persistence, they created the foundation for the interconnected world we inhabit today. The medieval merchant's legacy is all around us, in every international transaction, every global supply chain, every moment when people from different cultures and continents come together in the spirit of mutual benefit and exchange. They may have lived in what we call the Dark Ages, but they carried within themselves the light of human possibility, and that light has never been extinguished. As we face our own challenges in an increasingly complex and uncertain world, we might do well to remember these medieval pioneers. They remind us that even the most daunting obstacles can be overcome through innovation, cooperation, and the willingness to take calculated risks in pursuit of a better future. The harsh world of ancient traders may have ended with the fall of Rome, but the spirit of enterprise and adventure that drove them found new expression in their medieval successors and continues to drive human progress to this day.